Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if there are hidden patterns in how people think about themselves and others, especially when things get tough? Well, this new study might have some fascinating clues. Today we're diving into a study that looks at a tool called the Borderline Personality Inventory, or BPI. Now that might sound a bit clinical, but stick with me because it's all about understanding the deep structures of personality and how they might show up differently in people. Imagine personality like a building. Is it sturdy and well organized? Or are some parts a bit shaky or even built in a way that's hard to understand from the outside? This research looks at how well a specific tool, the Polish version of the BPI, measures these inner structures of personality. The folks behind this study wanted to see if the Polish version of the BPI is a reliable and accurate way to measure what it is supposed to measure. They're interested in something called borderline personality organization, which is a bit broader than a specific diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. It's more about how organized your personality is structurally. Think about things like your sense of self, how you defend yourself when stressed, how you relate to others, and your grasp on reality. So, what's the big picture? They evaluated this Polish BPI with about 600 people who were carefully matched for age and gender. They wanted to check a few key things. First, does the inventory actually measure the different parts it claims to measure? Like, for example, does it really capture identity diffusion separately from primitive defenses? Second, is the inventory consistent? If you take it today and again next week, would you get pretty similar results if nothing in your personality structure changed? Third, does it work better at measuring certain levels of personality organization, perhaps the more severe ones? And finally, a really important question, does the inventory work the same way for men and women? Because sometimes, even with the best intentions, surveys can accidentally show bias towards one group. The introduction sets the stage by talking about borderline personality disorder, or BPD, which is a serious condition. But it quickly broadens the scope to this idea of borderline personality organization rooted in Kernberg's object relations theory. This theory looks at personality not just as a set of traits, but as a way personality is structured. Are you solid and integrated in who you are, or is your sense of self a bit fractured or diffuse? Do you rely on healthy coping mechanisms or more primitive ones like splitting things into all good or all bad? This organizational view is where the BPI comes in. It's a self-report tool, meaning you answer questions about yourself, designed to capture these structural aspects. The BPI was developed to move from purely theoretical ideas about personality structure to something you can actually measure. It is not meant to replace in-depth clinical interviews, but it can be a useful screening tool or a way to gather more information. The researchers highlight that since the BPI has been used in Poland for a while, it is crucial to formally check its psychometric properties there. They specifically point out issues of gender-related item functioning, because how symptoms are expressed or reported can sometimes differ between genders, and they want to make sure the BPI isn't unfairly biased. So, the study had four main goals. 1. Check the internal structure to see if it matches the four theoretical factors: identity diffusion, primitive defenses, impaired reality testing, and fear of fusion. 2. Assess the reliability, essentially how consistent the scores are. 3. Use a fancy method called multidimensional item response theory, or MERT, to see how precise the BPI is at measuring different levels of borderline personality organization. And 4. Specifically investigate if any items function differently for men and women, what they call differential item functioning, or DIFE. How did they do it? They combined data from 7 different studies going back to 2012. About 1,640 people originally filled out the BPI, but they needed a clean data set with no missing information. They ended up with a final sample of 600 participants, carefully matched, so there were 300 women and 300 men, all between 18 and 36 years old. This matching was important because they were looking for gender differences. So they wanted the groups to be as similar as possible in age and gender balance to start with. Most participants had at least secondary education and were students or had higher education. The core measure, as we mentioned, was the Polish adaptation of the Borderline Personality Inventory. It has 51 true or false items, plus 2 extra ones. Importantly, for this study, they used the original Polish translation without changing any wording or how people responded. Now, for the nitty-gritty of how they analyzed all this data, they calculated basic descriptive statistics to get an overview of the scores. For reliability, they used something called Cronbach's alpha and McDonald's omega, which are standard ways to measure internal consistency. Then came the more complex stuff. They used confirmatory factor analysis, or CFA, to see if the data fit the expected four-factor model. Think of CFA like testing if a puzzle already put together perfectly matches the picture on the box. If it doesn't quite fit, they looked at modification indices to see if small tweaks could improve the fit. They also use multidimensional item response theory, or MERT, to look at the precision of measurement across different levels of personality organization. And for the gender comparison, they used the Mantel-Haenszel method to examine differential item functioning, or diff, applying a correction to make sure they weren't just seeing random chance differences. Let's get to what they found. The total BPI score ranged from 0 to 41, with an average around 13.5. Most people didn't score extremely high, which is typical for community samples where severe personality pathology is less common. But about 21% of participants did score above a clinical cutoff of 20 points. Interestingly, the subscale for impaired reality testing showed a very skewed distribution, meaning most people scored very low on this, with hardly anyone scoring in the upper range. This could mean the items in that section might not be great at differentiating people who have more significant issues with reality testing. When it comes to reliability, the Polish BPI did pretty well. The overall score had excellent internal consistency. The subscales were generally acceptable to good, with the highest reliability seen in the identity diffusion and cut -20 scales. Even the lower reliability for the fear of fusion subscale was within a reasonable range for research. The composite reliability was also high, suggesting that the four factors, as a latent construct, are measured with good consistency. The multidimensional item response theory analysis, or MERT, told us something interesting about measurement precision. It showed that the BPI provides more precise information, meaning it is better at telling apart individuals at higher levels of borderline personality organization. This fits with the idea that the BPI is designed to identify more pronounced personality pathology rather than subtle variations. However, they did notice that some individual items had low item information, meaning they weren't very precise in measuring the trait, consistent with original decisions to include them for clinical relevance, rather than statistical perfection. Now, about the internal structure, they checked for convergent and discriminant validity, which basically means, do the subscales measure what they're supposed to, and are they distinct enough from each other? The results here were a bit mixed. 3 out of the 4 factors had average variance extracted values below the recommended threshold, suggesting limited convergent validity. And none of the factors met the strict criteria for discriminant validity, meaning there was overlap between the dimensions. This indicates that the subscales are not completely independent, which the authors suggest is actually consistent with theoretical models that see these aspects of personality organization as deeply interconnected. The confirmatory factor analysis CFA was more promising. A simple one-factor model didn't fit well, but the four-factor model, reflecting identity diffusion, primitive defenses, impaired reality testing, and fear of fusion, showed a good fit. Even with some overlap, the four-factor structure held up reasonably well, aligning with the theoretical framework. They even tried a second-order factor model, which assumes the 4 factors are related to an even broader underlying factor. But that didn't significantly improve the fit, so they stuck with the 4 distinct but correlated factors. This brings us to the gender-related item functioning. This is where they looked for differential item functioning, or diff. They used the Mantel-Haenszel method to see if men and women responded differently to the same item, even if they had the same level of the underlying personality trait. Before they applied a correction for multiple comparisons, 4 items showed significant diff. However, after applying a statistical correction to avoid flagging random differences as significant, no item showed statistically significant gender-related diff. This is a really important finding. It means that for the most part, the items on the Polish BPI seem to work similarly for men and women in this sample, which is good news for the fairness of the instrument. While they noted some descriptive patterns for items related to substance use and legal issues being endorsed more by men, these differences did not reach statistical significance after their rigorous correction, supporting the comparability of item functioning across genders. So what does all this mean? The Polish BPI demonstrates acceptable reliability, especially for the overall score, and its 4-factor structure aligns with the theory behind it. The finding that the inventory is more precise at higher levels of borderline personality organization is also consistent with its intended use as a measure for more pronounced pathology. The intercorrelations between the factors are noted as expected, reflecting the complex and interconnected nature of personality structures within Kernberg's model. It suggests that while these 4 dimensions can be identified, they don't exist in isolation. The lack of significant gender-related diff is a key positive outcome. It means that the Polish BPI, as used in this study, appears to be a fair measure for both men and women, at least at the item level. This is crucial for ensuring that scores are interpretable and comparable across genders, helping to avoid potential biases in assessment. Now, like any study, this one has its limitations. The biggest one is using self-report measures. People can sometimes be unaware of their own difficulties, or might present themselves in a certain light. So, combining this with clinician assessments is always ideal for a complete picture. The sample was also a young adult community sample, not a clinical one. This means we don't know exactly how the BPI would perform in distinguishing between people with clinical diagnosis versus those without. They also point out that while the BPI is theoretically aligned with newer diagnostic systems, this study didn't directly test how its scores relate to those systems. Future research should definitely look at clinical populations to see how the BPI performs in a diagnostic context, compare it to established diagnoses, and examine its test-retest reliability and criterion validity, meaning how well it predicts other relevant outcomes. They specifically suggest re-examining gender related diff in clinical samples with external diagnostic criteria. In conclusion, the study provides good evidence for the psychometric soundness of the Polish borderline personality inventory in a young adult community sample. It supports the 4-factor theoretical model, shows acceptable reliability, and importantly, demonstrates no statistically significant gender. Related item functioning after rigorous correction. This supports the comparability of item functioning across women and men, while further research in clinical settings is needed to fully establish its clinical validity and its links with contemporary diagnostic systems. These findings support the use of the Polish BPI in research and suggest its potential utility in clinical assessment, particularly within frameworks that emphasize personality structure. So, what is my take on this? I think it is really encouraging to see research diving deep into the psychometric properties of assessment tools, especially for complex constructs like personality organization. The fact that the Polish BPI held up well in terms of its structure and, crucially, showed no significant gender bias after correction is a big win. It means this tool is likely a fair and valuable asset for researchers and clinicians in Poland. The limitations about the non-clinical sample and the need for more criterion validation are important points, highlighting that this is a solid foundation, but more work is needed to fully understand its clinical application. However, the precision it offers at higher levels of personality pathology is a promising area for future study, especially in helping to understand and address more severe forms of psychological distress. What do you think about these findings? Does understanding personality structure in this way resonate with you? Let me know in the comments below. If you found this breakdown helpful, please give it a thumbs up, share it with anyone who might be interested, and don't forget to subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more dives into the fascinating world of psychology. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.